Welcome to the world of sci-fi story, and don't forget the like and subscribe the channel. The storm was a beast that night, howling winds and heavy rain battering against the cabin windows. Riven had been used to these kinds of storms living out in the middle of nowhere, but something about tonight felt different. The air was charged with a strange, almost electric tension. He had pulled the blanket tighter around himself and turned up the heater, trying to settle in for a quiet night of reading, but then he heard it. A soft sound, almost like a whisper. It came from the bed. At first, he thought it was just the storm. But then came the movement, something warm and soft pressed against his side. His heart skipped a beat as he shot upright, shining the flashlight around. His eyes landed on a figure lying next to him, nestled under the covers. It was a woman, beautiful in a way he couldn't fully explain. Her skin was pale, but with a faint glowing sheen. Her dark, silver-flecked hair spilled across the pillow, and her eyes, huge, wide, and unnerving luminous, opened slowly, meeting his gaze. "Dolly, what are you doing in my bed?" Riven stammered, his voice thick with confusion and surprise. She blinked, clearly disoriented. "I was cold," she whispered in a voice that sounded like a song. Her accent was unfamiliar, a melody all its own. Riven's brain was trying to catch up, but all he could do was stare at her, utterly frozen. He had no idea who she was or how she'd gotten into his cabin. But here she was, curled up next to him, looking more vulnerable than anyone he'd ever seen. What are you?" he managed to ask, still trying to comprehend the situation. The woman shifted slightly, her delicate features barely visible in the dim light. "I'm not from here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't seem frightened. In fact, she almost seemed relieved. "Please, I didn't mean to intrude. The storm is not safe for me." Riven couldn't form a coherent thought. Instead, he found himself reacting on instinct, fumbling to pull the blanket around her, unsure of what was going on, but unwilling to throw her out in the middle of a freak storm. "You're telling me you're not from around here, and you just crawled into my bed?" Her eyes flickered with something like sadness. "I didn't know where else to go." Riven was still reeling from the strangeness of the situation when the wind howled again, rattling the cabin. He stared at her for a moment longer, wondering if he was dreaming. She seemed so otherworldly. There was something about her, something mesmerizing. He shook himself and forced his mind to focus. "All right, you're not from around here, but you're going to have to explain how you got here." She didn't say anything for a long moment. Her glowing eyes flickered, dimming slightly, as if she was uncertain. Finally, she spoke again. "I crash-landed." Riven raised an eyebrow. "Crash-landed? Are you?" "I'm not from your world," she said, her gaze intense, almost pleading. "I'm not supposed to be here." Riven tried to process what she said. Alien? His brain couldn't wrap around the idea, but there she was, sitting in his bed, looking like she belonged in some kind of fantasy tale. He shook his head. "This can't be happening." "I know it's hard to understand," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "But I need to rest. Please let me stay just for a little while." Her eyes met his, and for a moment, the room seemed to grow quieter, the storm outside fading into the background. There was something in her gaze that made Riven's heart beat faster, an unspoken connection that was starting to gnaw at the edges of his consciousness. He sighed, glancing toward the door. The storm was only getting worse. He could hear the wind pounding against the walls. As much as he wanted to ask more questions to figure out exactly what was happening, he knew he didn't have the heart to turn her away. "Fine," he said, still trying to make sense of it all. "You can stay for now, but when the storm's over, we're talking. I need answers." She smiled, and it was like the room brightened just a little bit. "Thank you." Riven settled back down, though the presence beside him made it impossible to sleep. His thoughts raced, but as he lay there, he found himself glancing over at her more often than he cared to admit. She wasn't just an alien, he realized. She was different. There was a strange energy about her that he couldn't quite explain, something magnetic, like he was drawn to her in a way he couldn't control. But what was happening? And who, or what, was she? The morning light filtered through the cabin's small windows, casting soft beams across the room. Riven awoke slowly, the events of the previous night still swirling in his mind. His body felt heavy, but not from sleep. More like he'd been carrying the weight of something unexplainable all night. He turned his head and found her, Veen. He learned her name just after he drifted off, still asleep beside him. She looked peaceful now, almost ethereal in the daylight. Her silver-flecked hair spread across the pillow like some kind of celestial tapestry. For a moment, Riven simply stared at her, wondering if this was all some strange, vivid dream. But then she shifted, and her eyes fluttered open, locking with his. There was no shock in her gaze, no hint of alarm. She merely blinked slowly, as if it was the most natural thing in the world to wake up next to a stranger. "Good morning," she said softly, her voice thick with a remnant of sleep. Riven cleared his throat, unsure of how to react. "Morning. You slept well, I assume." She smiled faintly, though there was something almost sad about it. "I did. I was safe." There was an odd finality in her tone that made Riven uneasy. He couldn't tell if she was referring to the storm or something else entirely. "What exactly happened last night?" Riven finally asked, unable to hold back any longer. "You said you're not from here." "That doesn't make sense." "How? How is that possible?" Veen sat up, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. She seemed to gather her thoughts for a moment before responding, as though she was deciding just how much to tell him. "I'm from a faraway place," she began, her voice quiet, almost hesitant. "A place far beyond the stars. My kind, my people, we're not like humans. We're connected to the energy of the universe in ways you wouldn't understand." Riven frowned, listening intently. He was still having trouble wrapping his head around it, but he needed answers. "So you're telling me you're from another planet?" "Yes," Veen replied, her eyes flickering with something deeper. "I'm not just any alien. I'm from a royal lineage, and I've been running." "Running?" Riven repeated. "From who?" She hesitated, looking out the window as though trying to gather the courage to speak. "I was chosen for someone. My kind mate." Her voice grew quieter with each word, like she was ashamed to say it. "But I didn't want it. I didn't want to be bonded to someone I didn't choose. And when I refused, they pursued me. They've been hunting me ever since." Riven's eyes widened as the pieces started falling into place. This wasn't just a random crash landing. Beam wasn't just some lost traveler. She was a fugitive, a royal fugitive on the run from whatever force had the power to track her across the stars. "That's insane," Riven muttered. "You're saying someone's after you because you didn't want to be mated to them." Vane nodded, her eyes downcast. "Yes, it's how our people live. We're matched before we're born, bonded to another from the moment we're conceived. But not everyone wants it. Not everyone believes in it." She paused, her gaze flickering back to him. I couldn't live that way." Riven wasn't sure how to respond. His head was spinning. Everything he thought he knew about the world had just been appended in a single night. But the more he listened to Vane, the more he felt an overwhelming urge to protect her. "How long have you been running?" he asked softly. "For years," she replied, the sadness in her voice making Riven's chest tighten. "I thought I could outrun them. I'm tired. I'm so tired." Riven stared at her, trying to understand what she must have gone through. Being hunted, chased, trapped in a life she didn't want. "I can't help you much," he said after a long silence, "but I'll protect you for as long as I can. You're safe here for now." A flicker of surprise passed across Veen's face, followed by a warmth that seemed to spread throughout the room. "You would protect me?" she asked, almost as if she couldn't quite believe it. Riven nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was getting himself into. "I don't know what else to do. I can't just send you back out there." Veen's smile was faint, but it was enough to make Riven's heart flutter unexpectedly. "Thank you," she whispered, her eyes glowing brighter than before, almost like they were reflecting the gratitude she felt. As the days passed, Riven and Veen settled into an uneasy routine. The storm had passed, but the world outside felt foreign and strange. Riven would keep watch, checking the surrounding woods, wondering if anyone was following her. And Veen, well, she seemed to grow more and more anxious with each passing day. Then one night, after a particularly long silence between them, Veen turned to him and said something that took Riven by surprise. "You don't know what it feels like," she said quietly, her voice almost breaking, "to be wanted by someone you can't love, to be forced into a bond you never asked for. I didn't expect to feel this way with you." Riven felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "What do you mean?" he asked, though his heart already had a sinking feeling. Vane met his gaze, her eyes shining with something tender, something he hadn't expected. "You make me feel safe, not like I'm some object to be owned, but like I belong here with you." Riven's breath caught in his throat. The air between them seemed to hum with an unspoken tension, something delicate and fragile that he couldn't ignore. He swallowed hard, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "I don't know what's happening, but I can't deny that I feel it too." Her smile was slow, hesitant, but full of a quiet, undeniable warmth. And in that moment, Riven knew whatever was happening between them, whatever this connection was, it was real. The next few days felt like they were suspended in time. Riven couldn't quite shake the feeling that everything around him had changed. The world outside his cabin, once so familiar, now felt like a distant memory. He had never expected to be in this situation, caught between something strange, something out of his control, but every time he looked at Vane, his heart beat faster. It wasn't just the mystery of her or her otherworldly beauty. There was something else, something deeper that pulled him toward her. And no matter how much he tried to deny it, he couldn't escape it. She had stayed in the cabin for days now, watching the horizon for signs of anyone pursuing her. Riven did what he could to help, gathering food, checking the perimeter, trying to keep the cabin hidden. But the more time they spent together, the more the tension between them built. One evening, after Riven had brought in some firewood, he noticed that Vane was standing by the window, staring out at the stars. She looked so small, so fragile against the vastness of the night sky. He approached her quietly, not wanting to startle her. "You okay?" he asked, his voice gentle. Vane didn't immediately respond, her gaze still locked on the sky. "I'm not used to this," she finally said, her voice soft but laced with uncertainty. "I'd never been without my people before, without my kind." Riven felt a pang of sympathy for her. He couldn't imagine what it would be like being torn from everything you knew, chased by your own kind, forced into a life you never wanted. "You're not alone here," he said quietly, his words carrying more weight than he intended. She turned to look at him, her eyes soft but conflicted. "I know, but I feel so lost. I don't know who I am without them, without the bond." Riven didn't know how to respond. The bond she spoke of, the one that tied her to someone she didn't love, was something beyond his comprehension. But in that moment, he realized something important. He wasn't just offering her safety. He was offering her something else, something that neither of them had expected. "You don't have to be alone anymore," he said, stepping closer to her. Vane's breath hitched as she looked at him, her gaze flickering from his eyes to his lips. For a moment, time seemed to freeze, the distance between them shrinking until there was nothing left but the quiet crackling of the fire and the sound of their breathing. And then, without thinking, without warning, Vane stepped forward and kissed him. It was soft at first, tentative, like she wasn't sure if she should be doing this. But it didn't matter. Riven's hands found her waist, pulling her closer, his heart racing as he kissed her back. The kiss deepened, more urgent now, and in that moment, everything made sense. All the confusion, the fear, the questions, they melted away, leaving only the feeling that, despite everything, this was right. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathless, staring at each other like they'd just crossed some invisible line. I didn't mean to," Vane began, her voice shaky. Riven shook his head, cutting her off. "Don't apologize." He paused, his heart pounding in his chest. "I feel it too." Vane took a step back, her face flushed with the intensity of the moment. "But I'm not." "You're not what?" Riven asked, taking her hand gently, pulling her back to him. "You're not what? Different. You think I care about that?" She hesitated, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "I don't know what this means. I don't even know who I am anymore. I'm not from your world. I'm lost." "You're not lost to me," Riven said firmly, his voice filled with conviction. "You're here now. That's all that matters." Vane looked at him, her expression a mix of surprise and something else, something like hope. And in that moment, Riven realized just how much he had changed in the last few days. He wasn't just protecting her anymore. He was beginning to care about her in a way that went far beyond just offering refuge. Something had shifted between them, something undeniable. Later that night, they sat together by the fire, a quiet stillness between them. Riven couldn't help but steal glances at her, watching the way the firelight danced across her features. Vane seemed lost in thought, her gaze distant again, like she was somewhere far away. He wanted to ask her what she was thinking, but he knew that wasn't something you could force. Instead, he reached over and gently brushed a lock of hair away from her face, causing her to look up at him. "You're safe here," he said, his voice low and steady. "And I'm not going anywhere." For a long moment, Vane didn't say anything. Then finally, she smiled, small but genuine. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice carrying a weight of gratitude that made Riven's chest tighten. And though he knew the world outside was still full of dangers, full of questions they hadn't yet answered, in that moment he felt a peace he hadn't known in years. As the days turned into weeks, The bond between them only deepened. The tension, the uncertainty, the danger. It was all still there, but they found solace in each other. Riven realized he wasn't just offering her a safe haven. He was giving her a chance to choose her own path, to find her own way, free from the chains of a life she never asked for. And Vane, she was learning to trust again, to believe that she could have something of her own, a love that wasn't forced, a future she could choose. No matter what came next, they would face it together. The days blurred into each other, the quiet life they had carved out together in the small cabin becoming more and more of a reality. Riven had almost forgotten what it was like to have someone so close, someone who could share the silence with him without feeling like it was an awkward thing. With Vane, every moment seemed to flow, even when they didn't speak. But Riven knew that the peace they found wasn't going to last forever. There were still so many unanswered questions about Vane, about her people, and the danger that lurked just beyond the horizon. And though she seemed to find comfort in their quiet moments, Riven could see the fear in her eyes when she thought he wasn't looking, the kind of fear that comes from knowing you're not safe, no matter how much you want to believe it. One morning, Riven woke early to the sound of soft whispers. He rubbed his eyes, still half dazed from sleep, and turned his head toward the source of the sound. Vane stood near the window, her back to him, speaking in a low voice. It wasn't to him. It was almost as if she was talking to someone else. Riven didn't move immediately, unsure of what to do. Was she communicating with someone? Was she reaching out to her people? Her words were soft. And though he couldn't make out everything she said, there was one word that sent a chill down his spine. Bonded. Riven's heart raced as he slowly pushed himself up, his body stiff from lying in bed for so long. He had to know what was going on. Slowly, he rose and made his way over to her, his feet light on the creaky floorboards. Veen, he called gently, his voice cautious, as though afraid of breaking the fragile moment. She turned quickly, her eyes wide with alarm. The look in her eyes, a mixture of guilt and fear, struck him harder than he expected. Vane didn't speak right away. Instead, she glanced nervously out the window, as though she was checking for something or someone. "Who are you talking to?" Riven asked, trying to keep his voice steady. He didn't want to sound accusing, but there was an edge of concern there, something he couldn't shake. Violet hesitated, then closed her eyes briefly, like she was gathering the strength to speak. "I wasn't talking to anyone. I was just trying to reach out to him." "Him?" Riven asked, his heart suddenly pounding in his chest. He already knew the answer, but hearing it out loud made the weight of it even heavier. She nodded, her gaze distant. "The one I was meant to bond with, my kind mate." Riven's stomach twisted. The bond she had spoken of, the one she tried to escape, was not just a figurative thing. It was real. "You were trying to reach him." His voice was almost a whisper, as if saying the words aloud would make the situation worse. "Why? After everything?" "I don't want it," Veen said quickly, her voice desperate. "I don't want the bond. I never did. But sometimes when I'm alone, I can feel him, feel the connection pulling at me. It's like I can't escape it. I need to break it completely, but I can't." Riven's heart clenched as he reached out for her, his hands gently cupping her face, forcing her to look at him. "You don't have to do this alone. You're not alone, Vane. We'll figure this out together." She closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek, and for a brief moment, Riven was certain she was about to tell him the truth, to reveal the full extent of what had been haunting her. But then her eyes snapped open again, and the fear was back, stronger than before. "They're coming for me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I can feel it. I've been running for so long, and now they found me." Riven's pulse quickened as the weight of her words settled in. He had known, deep down, that it was never going to be as simple as just hiding away in the cabin. Her past, her people, they would find her eventually. But hearing her say it out loud, he could feel the fear in her voice, the terror that had been building ever since she arrived. "Who's coming for you?" he demanded, his hands trembling slightly as they dropped from her face. "How do you know?" "I can sense them," she whispered, her eyes wide with panic. "I don't know how, but I can feel their presence. The bond. It's not just something I can turn off. They know I'm trying to escape it, and they won't stop until I'm—" She broke off, a sob escaping her lips before she could finish. Riven didn't know what to say. His mind was spinning. He had no idea what kind of force could track someone across the stars, but if Ian's words were true, they wouldn't be safe for long. "We need to leave," he said, his voice firm. "We can't stay here. Not with them so close." No, Bean said quickly, shaking her head. You can't come with me. They'll follow you too. It's too dangerous. Riven's heart sank at her words. The idea of losing her, of letting her leave alone, was unbearable. But he could see the fear in her eyes, the fear that if he stayed, it would only put him in more danger. Still, the thought of being apart from her, it hurt. You're not going alone, Riven said with quiet resolve. I'm coming with you. We'll face this together, Bean. Whatever happens next, we'll figure it out together. Bean's eyes softened, but her expression was filled with uncertainty. You don't know what you're asking, Riven. I can't promise you that you'll be safe. I don't want you to get hurt because of me. But Riven took her hands in his, squeezing them tightly. I don't care about that. You matter more than anything else. For a moment, the world outside seemed to fade, leaving only the two of them. The storm, the danger, everything felt distant, like it didn't matter when she was with him. And in that moment, Riven knew, no matter what came next, he would follow her into the unknown. He couldn't let her face this alone. The air outside had grown colder, the wind picking up in gusts, as if nature itself was aware of the tension building between Riven and Vane. They stood in the small cabin, both of them preparing for what lay ahead. But there was an unspoken understanding between them. They had no idea what they were truly up against. Still, there was no turning back now. Riven wasn't about to let her leave alone, not when she needed him most. They packed what little they could carry, Riven's mind racing with thoughts of how they could possibly escape the danger that was closing in. The cabin had been a refuge, a temporary hiding place, but now it felt like a trap. And every second they stayed here, the walls seemed to get tighter. As they made their way to the door, Vane hesitated, her fingers lingering on the handle. I'm scared, Riven, she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. I've been running for so long, and I'm so tired. I don't know what to do anymore. Riven stepped closer to her, his hand resting on her shoulder in an attempt to reassure her. You don't have to be afraid. We'll find a way out of this together. His voice was steady, though the fear gnawing at him was impossible to ignore. He had no idea how they were going to outrun the kind of danger she had been facing, but there was one thing he was sure of. He would protect her with everything he had. Vane nodded slowly, but there was a lingering uncertainty in her eyes. She wasn't sure if she believed him, or if she even believed in herself anymore. But she was still here, still willing to trust him, despite everything. They left the cabin together, stepping into the cold, star-filled night. The forest around them seemed alive, the shadows deeper than usual, as if watching them waiting. Riven kept a tight grip on her hand, leading her through the trees with determination. He had no plan, no real direction, but he was certain of one thing: they couldn't stay in one place for too long. They needed to move to keep ahead of whatever was hunting her. They didn't speak much during the walk, both of them lost in their thoughts. But Riven couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in his gut. There was something wrong, something that he couldn't quite place. Vane's presence beside him was comforting, but it also made him feel vulnerable, as though they were already being watched. By the time they reached the edge of the forest, the wind had grown sharper, and the first traces of dawn were beginning to break through the dark sky. Riven turned to Vane, his brow furrowed. We need to find somewhere safer, he said, his voice low and urgent. Somewhere to rest, to plan. Vane nodded, her expression distant as she scanned their surroundings. I know a place, she said after a moment, her voice quiet but steady. A hidden sanctuary far from here. It's not far, but it's well protected. We can stay there for a while. Without waiting for his response, she started walking, her pace quickening as if she knew the way by heart. Riven followed her closely, not questioning her decision. He trusted her, even if he didn't fully understand everything about her world. The journey took them deeper into the mountains, where the terrain became rough and the air thinner. Riven struggled to keep up, but he didn't complain. There was a sense of urgency in Vale's movements, something almost frantic in the way she moved, as though time was running out. After what felt like hours of navigating steep cliffs and thick brush, they reached a hidden valley surrounded by high stone walls. It was a secluded, almost magical place, untouched by the outside world. The silence was deafening, and for a moment, Riven wondered if they had somehow stepped into another realm entirely. Vane slowed her pace, her expression softening as she looked around. This is it, she said, her voice filled with a mixture of relief and sadness. This is where I've hidden before. It's safe here, well, for now. Riven breathed a sigh of relief, the tension in his chest easing as he looked around the quiet valley. The stone walls that surrounded them seemed to pulse with a strange energy, and though the landscape was wild and untouched, there was a sense of tranquility here that he hadn't felt in days. They made their way to a small hidden cave within the valley, where Vane said they could rest for the night. The entrance was narrow, nearly invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Once inside, Vane sat down, her pack, and leaned against the cool stone wall, her eyes closing as if she was finally able to breathe for the first time in ages. Riven sat beside her, his mind still racing. "We'll be okay here for a while, right?" he asked, his voice tight with uncertainty. "For now," Vane replied, her voice quiet but assured. "But it's only a matter of time before they find me again. I can feel the bond tightening. I can feel them getting closer." Riven turned to look at her, his eyes searching hers for any sign of fear or hesitation. "We'll figure this out together, I promise." Vane met his gaze, her eyes full of gratitude and something deeper, something that made Riven's heart race. She reached out and gently took his hand in hers, her fingers warm against his. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. "You don't have to stay. You've already done more than anyone else ever had. I don't want to drag you into this mess. You deserve a life of peace." Riven shook his head, a soft smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "I don't care about peace, not anymore." He squeezed her hand. "I care about you. And if that means facing whatever's coming, then I'm ready. We'll fight this together, Vane. I won't leave you." The warmth in Vane's eyes was the only answer he needed. She didn't speak, but she didn't have to. In that moment she knew he would stay by her side, no matter the cost. But as the night wore on, a feeling of unease settled over them both. Something was coming. Vane could feel it, as if the bond between her and her kind mate was drawing her closer to the danger she had been running from all along. And Riven, he had no idea what was coming next, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let her face it alone. The days in the hidden valley passed slowly, the quiet only interrupted by the occasional gust of wind or the distant calls of animals. For a brief moment, it felt like Riven and Vane had found a sanctuary, a place far removed from the chaos that had been chasing her. But the unease never fully left them. Vane had grown quieter with each passing day, her thoughts clearly elsewhere, and Riven could feel the weight of the unspoken between them. He couldn't help but wonder how long they would really be safe here.